My son walked onto the factory floor in a tailored suit, placed 3 legal documents on my workbench, and said, "Sign them. I never want to inherit a single thing from you." Every co-worker watched in silence while the CEO stood a few steps behind him with a satisfied smile. I didn't argue. I simply asked him to sign all 3 copies first. He thought he had erased me from his life forever. He had no idea those signatures were the biggest mistake he would ever make. Some of the most powerful stories start quietly. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever had to stay silent about something important for years? Yes or no, I read everyone. Just a quick note, some details are fictionalized for storytelling and reflection. What matters most is the message it carries. The notebook took my $4 and gave me nothing back. Wrong story. This one cost me 15 years and 68 hours a week. I sat in my 2009 pickup at 5:47 a.m., the parking lot dark, except for the pale yellow glow of the shop lights bleeding through the high windows of Vanguard steel. The notebook lay open on my lap, its cover fraying at the edges, pages warped from years of sweat and weather. 7 minutes before my shift started. 7 minutes I'd claimed every morning for the last 15 years. Vernon Caldwell, 60 years old, machinery maintenance worker. Grease under my fingernails that no amount of scrubbing ever got out. That's who people saw when they looked at me. That's who I needed them to see. I clicked my pen and wrote the date in the top corner. July 8th, 2024. Monday, 5:47 a.m. Clear sky, 62 degrees. Machine B7 hydraulic pressure inconsistent reported twice last week, denied once. I wrote it in my own shorthand, a script that looked like random machinery observations to anyone who glanced over my shoulder. Numbers that could mean torque specs or temperature readings. Dates that looked like maintenance schedules, 68 hours. That's what my week looked like in one number. 12-hour shifts, 6 days running, because the overtime paid for Thane's apartment when he was 23 and too proud to live with his old man. Paid for the car insurance when he wrecked his first sedan. Paid for the quiet, invisible things a father does when his son won't let him do them out loud. I closed the notebook and slid it into the glove compartment beneath a stack of old repair manuals. The truck smelled like coffee and cold metal. My thermos sat in the cup holder, still warm. Outside, the sky was starting to bruise purple at the edges. Today was the last day I would sit here as an ordinary worker. I didn't know it yet at 5:47 a.m. The workshop floor at 9:23 a.m. smelled like hot metal and cutting oil. I was crouched beside an air compressor on the east wall, tightening a bolt that had been rattling for 2 days. The wrench was cold in my hand despite the heat. Across the floor, Clifford Whitfield, 63, inspected line B with the quiet competence of a man who'd worked loading docks for 20 years before moving to quality control. We'd started the same week back in 2009. He knew when to talk and when to let a man work in silence. The machine noise was constant. The rhythmic clang of the press, the hiss of pneumatic lines, the low hum of conveyors moving steel through the building like a heartbeat. Then the side doors swung open. 2 seconds of silence. Not real silence. The machines didn't stop. But every head on the floor turned, and in that collective pause you could feel the shift. Thane Caldwell, 32 years old, walked onto the shop floor in a navy suit so crisp it had never been within 10 feet of grease. Planning manager for Vanguard's operations division. My son. He moved like he belonged anywhere. He decided to stand shoulders back, eyes scanning the rows of machinery with the casual assessment of someone who saw systems, not people. Behind him, 3 feet back and slightly to the left, walked Harlan Prescott. 58 CEO of Vanguard Steel for the last 12 years, hands in his pockets, smiling. Not the polite smile you give workers during a floor tour. The smile you wear when you're holding cards no one else has seen yet. You want to know when I knew the moment I didn't hear Thane's footsteps hesitate. I kept my head down, kept the wrench moving. The bolt didn't need more tightening, but my hands needed something to do that looked like purpose. Clifford's eyes found mine for half a second. I gave him nothing back. Thane's shoes clicked against the concrete. Leather soles, not steel-toed boots. He stopped in the center of the floor, and I could feel him searching. Not looking at machines. Looking for someone. I tightened the bolt another quarter turn. The compressor casing was warm under my palm. My knees ached from crouching. Sweat ran down the back of my neck despite the industrial fans pushing air through the building. I could smell the metallic tang of fresh-cut steel and the faint sweetness of hydraulic fluid leaking somewhere on Line C. Harlan said something I couldn't hear over the press. Thane nodded, didn't smile back. My son stood in the center of the shop floor wearing a suit that cost more than I made in a month. And he was scanning past the machinery, past the workers bent over their stations, past Clifford pretending to check a readout on the control panel. Looking for me, I set the wrench down on top of the compressor, wiped my hands on my coveralls. Stood up slow the way you do when your back has been bent for 43 years of shift work. When I straightened, our eyes met across 30 feet of workshop floor. Thane didn't smile, didn't nod. Just stared at me with the kind of blank professional distance you use on a stranger. Harlan's hands were still in his pockets, still smiling. Watching me the way you watch a man you've already buried. The machine noise didn't stop. My heart did. Every worker on the floor was looking now, not openly. You don't stare at the CEO and the planning manager when they walk onto your shift, but you notice. You file it away. You wait to see who's about to get fired, promoted, or humiliated. Thane took 2 steps forward. Harlan stayed where he was, 3 feet back, hands in pockets, smile still painted on like he was posing for a company photo. My son stood in the center of the shop floor. His eyes locked on me, crouched beside the compressor with grease on my hands and 15 years of patience in my chest. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed. Someone's radio played low near the break room. The press clanged again, metal biting metal, and Harlan Prescott stood 3 feet behind my son, watching me the way you watch a man you've already buried, waiting to see if I understood what was about to happen. I understood. Thane took the first step, then the second. Workers on the line stepped back without being asked, creating a path across the concrete floor. He held a folder in his right hand, navy blue edges crisp. The folder hit the metal workbench with the specific sound of a decision that's been rehearsed and can't be taken back. I didn't flinch. Kept my hands loose at my sides, grease still on my palms from the compressor bolt. The shop floor was silent except for the machines. 23 people watching. I counted them without turning my head. Thane's jaw was tight. He looked at me the way you look at something broken that you're finally throwing away. "You've been a disgrace to me my entire life," he said, loud enough that the workers near Line B could hear every word. "I'm done pretending you're my father." Harlan stood 8 feet back, hands in his pockets, smiling. He'd probably written the script. I didn't respond, just looked at my son standing there in his navy suit, his shoes so polished they caught the fluorescent lights, and waited. Thane opened the folder, pulled out 3 stapled documents, fanned them across the workbench like evidence at a trial. The header on the first page was printed in bold 14-point font, "Voluntary Waiver of Inheritance Rights." "I want nothing from you," Thane said. His voice had that careful control people use when they're performing anger instead of feeling it. "Not your name, not your money. Nothing." He slid the top document toward me. Sign it. I'm renouncing you. Legally. Permanently. The workshop had gone completely silent. Even the hum of the ventilation system seemed to drop an octave. I could smell the cutting oil and the faint burned rubber scent from the conveyor belts. My knees still ached from crouching by the compressor. I picked up the document, read it slowly. Not because I didn't know what it said. I'd known what it would say for 15 years. But because a man who's just been publicly humiliated doesn't skim. He reads every word like he's trying to find the mistake that explains how his son turned into this. The legal language was clean, professionally drafted. Thane Caldwell hereby voluntarily waives, renounces, and relinquishes any and all claims to inheritance, estate proceeds, financial assets, or familial rights from Vernon Caldwell, biological father, effective upon notarization filing, and any future triggering event, including death or intestate distribution. I set the first copy down, picked up the second, read it the same way, then the third. Thane shifted his weight. The confidence in his performance was starting to crack at the edges. He'd expected tears, shouting, begging, something that proved he'd landed the blow. I gave him nothing. I looked up, met his eyes. Copy 1, copy 2, copy 3. I said. My voice was level, the same tone I used when ordering parts inventory. Sign and date them. If you're going to do this, do it properly. People think humiliation is the worst thing that can happen to you in front of 20 witnesses. They're wrong. The worst thing is realizing you're exactly where you plan to be. Thane blinked. Confusion flickered across his face for half a second before he buried it. He pulled a pen from his inside jacket pocket, expensive silver, the kind you get engraved when you make manager. Clicked it once. He signed the first copy. Thane Caldwell, Planning Manager, Vanguard Steel Operations. Dated it. July 8th, 2024. Signed the second copy. Same signature, same title, same date. Signed the third. I watched my son sign my name off 3 separate pages like he was closing a vendor contract. His handwriting was neat, confident. He dotted the I in Caldwell with a small, precise mark. Harlan was still standing 8 feet back, still smiling. He thought he'd won. Thought he'd watched a father get dismantled in front of his co-workers by his own son. Thought the maintenance worker with grease under his nails had just been legally erased. Thane set the pen down on the workbench. Looked at me like he was waiting for me to collapse. I nodded once. Then Clifford Whitfield stepped forward. He'd been standing near the corner of the workshop since the doors opened. 20 feet from my workstation, close enough to hear every word, far enough that most people hadn't noticed him. Now he moved with the same quiet competence he brought to inspecting Line B. No hesitation, no surprise. Like he'd been waiting for this exact cue. Clifford's hand reached past Thane and picked up the first 2 copies, the ones with Thane's fresh signature still drying in blue ink. He met my eyes for half a second. I gave him the smallest nod. He turned and walked toward the side exit, the door that led to the parking lot, the gate. The notary office I'd confirmed was open at 9 that morning. Thane's face shifted. The performance cracked. "Wait, where is he?" I picked up my wrench, turned back to the compressor, crouched down like nothing had happened. Like my son hadn't just publicly renounced me in front of the entire workshop. Like Clifford Whitfield hadn't just walked out with 2 legally binding documents and left Thane holding the third copy like a receipt. 15 years. You want to know what you can build in 15 years if nobody's watching. I tightened the bolt I'd already tightened twice. The metal was warm under my palm. My back protested the crouch, but I held it, listening to Thane's breathing behind me, listening to the shuffle of workers pretending to go back to their stations, listening to Harlan's shoes clicking against the concrete as he finally moved. What just happened? Thane's voice, quieter now. The anger replaced by something that sounded like the first edge of panic. I didn't turn around, kept my focus on the compressor, the wrench, the work I'd been doing before my son decided to erase me. Dad. The word hung in the air. The first time he'd called me that in 3 years. The first time the performance broke completely. I didn't answer. Clifford walked out through the bay doors, with the 2 original signed copies in his hand, heading toward the notary office across the gate. Thane stood in the middle of the shop floor, surrounded by paper scraps and confusion, still holding the 3rd copy, still not understanding what he'd just done. I'd been waiting 15 years for him to do this exact thing. I didn't answer him, just turned back to the compressor and listened to his footsteps retreat. Heard Harlan's low voice murmuring something, heard the bay doors swing shut. While I tightened a bolt that didn't need tightening, Clifford walked through the door of a notary office 400 yards from the plant gate. Sterling Holbrook had been sitting there with cold coffee for 23 minutes. He was 65, silver-haired, wearing a charcoal suit that cost more than 3 months of my salary. Corporate attorney. 40 years of practice in rooms where documents changed lives. He'd been my attorney for 15 years, and nobody at Vanguard Steel knew his name. Clifford set the 2 documents on the counter. Voluntary waiver of inheritance rights, 2 original copies, signed and dated this morning. Dorothy Kimball. The notary public pulled the documents toward her with the efficiency of 30 years witnessing signatures that couldn't be unsigned. Maybe 55 reading glasses on a chain, the kind of professional who doesn't waste words. She reviewed the pages, checked Thane's signature, verified the date. The stamp hit the paper at 9:47 a.m. Then again on the 2nd copy. 4 minutes start to finish. Legal. Binding. Irreversible. Sterling picked up both notarized originals, folded them, once slid them into his briefcase. He looked at Clifford, nodded once. Phase 1 complete. No other words needed. Clifford walked back through the gate at 9:52 a.m. I was still crouched by the compressor wrench, moving in slow circles, listening. Harlan's voice cut through the machine noise, low and urgent. I heard the tone, not the words. The kind of whisper that thinks it's quiet, but carries. Thane moved fast, paper ripping. The folder torn in half, then quarters, then confetti. Pieces of navy blue cardboard and white pages scattering across the concrete like evidence being destroyed. I set my wrench down, stood up, turned around. Thane stood in a pile of shredded paper, hands shaking. Harlan was 3 feet behind him, hands out of his pockets, now watching me without the smile. I looked at the scattered pieces, looked at my son. The paper you just tore up was the 3rd draft, I said. Same tone I'd used to tell him to sign properly. The 2 original copies were notarized 8 minutes ago at the office across the gate. The waiver is fully legally binding. You no longer have the right to claim a single penny of my inheritance. You want to know the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge is loud. Justice is a notary stamp at 9:49 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Thane's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Confusion, realization, panic. You planned this, he said. Yes. Harlan stepped forward. For the first time since walking onto the shop floor, he spoke directly to me. His voice was tight control, slipping. You really think that 5 million is going to save you? 5 million. He'd found the original patent sale records, public filing 2009 cash equivalent listed before the equity conversion. Old numbers, incomplete picture. He thought that was the ceiling. Like he'd spent time reviewing my finances, calculating what a maintenance worker could possibly have accumulated. Like he'd been watching me longer than I'd been watching him. I didn't respond, just registered the number. Filed it away with 15 years of observations written in notebooks nobody else could read. Thane's expression shifted. The panic faded. His eyes sharpened with new interest. $5 million. Suddenly, the inheritance he'd renounced became real. 5 million, Thane repeated. He looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. You have $5 million. I picked up my work gloves from the compressor, pulled them off slowly, one finger at a time, folded them, and set them on the workbench. 15 years. Not a single early departure. Not for holidays, not for illness, not for the 3 times Thane called, asking me to help him move. I'd stayed until the shift horn blew at 6 p.m. every day for 15 years straight. I looked at Harlan, met his eyes for the first time since he'd walked onto my floor. I'm leaving early today, I said. The words felt strange, like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. I walked toward the bay doors. Didn't hurry. Didn't look back. Just moved with the same steady pace I'd used for 43 years, boots hitting concrete in the rhythm I could walk in my sleep. Behind me, Thane said something to Harlan. Harlan's response was too quiet to hear, but the tone was sharp, confused. The first edge of doubt creeping into a plan that had seemed certain an hour ago. Clifford was back at line B. Our eyes met as I passed. He gave me the smallest nod. I returned it. The workshop doors swung open. Sunlight hit my face brighter and warmer than the fluorescent overheads. 10:02 a.m. My pickup sat in its usual spot, 4th row back. I unlocked it, climbed in, set my folded work gloves on the passenger seat next to the notebook from 5:47 a.m. that morning. The truck smelled like coffee and cold metal. I didn't start the engine. Just sat there, hands on the steering wheel, looking at the workshop building. Harlan was in there trying to calculate what he'd just revealed and what it meant that I was walking away mid-shift for the first time in 15 years. He knew about $5 million. He'd said it with the confidence of a man who'd done research, but he didn't know yet that 5 million was the least important number in this equation. The real number was 51%, and I'd owned it for a decade and a half. I started the engine and drove home. 23 minutes through East Columbus traffic, past the strip malls and gas stations I'd passed twice a day for 15 years. Pulled into the driveway of a house I'd owned outright since 1998. Sat there with the engine off, looking at the front door. The hardest part wasn't signing away my son in front of 20 witnesses. It was sitting alone at my kitchen table 11 hours later, holding a photograph of a 7-year-old boy who used to think I was strong enough to carry him on my shoulders forever. 9 p.m. The notebook sat open in front of me. Blank page. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't know what to write. The photograph was from a company picnic in 1999. Thane was 7, wearing a Vanguard steel t-shirt 3 sizes too big, sitting on my shoulders with his hands in my hair. We were both smiling. I remembered the weight of him up there, how light he felt, how he'd laughed when I pretended to stumble. I set the photo down on the kitchen table next to the notebook, picked up my phone, looked at Sterling's number, held it for a long moment, dialed. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been waiting by the phone. I'm reviewing the files, Sterling said. No greeting, no small talk. Are you ready? Ready since 3 years ago, I said. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, my office. I'll be there. He hung up. I set the phone down and stared at the photograph for another 20 minutes. Then I closed the notebook without writing a single word, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. A photograph is a lie you can hold in your hands, proof that a moment existed exactly as you remember it, even when the person in it doesn't remember you at all. Sterling's office was on the 12th floor of a glass building in downtown Columbus, the kind of place where elevators opened directly into reception areas with leather couches and abstract art. I'd been here 3 times in 15 years, always early morning, always when nobody else was around. He stood when I walked in. We shook hands like men who'd stood under fire together 35 years ago, which we had. Army, Fort Benning, different lifetimes. Sterling was 65, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost what I made in a month. But his handshake was the same as it had been in 1989, firm, brief, no performance. "Coffee?" he asked. "No." We sat at the conference table. He spread files across the surface like evidence at trial. Documents, spreadsheets, legal instruments I'd signed years ago and filed away in parts of my memory I didn't visit often. The initial 35%, Sterling said, tapping the first document, came from the patent to equity swap in 2009. You'd spent 11 years on the floor reverse engineering every system in that building and built a hydraulic pressure regulation system that cut Vanguard's equipment failure rate by 40%. Grady Whitmore needed it. You negotiated equity instead of cash payment. He agreed. Direct transfer. 35% of Vanguard Steel Group holdings. I nodded. I knew this part. I'd lived it. Sterling moved to the next stack. Those shares generated dividends, quarterly payments into a trust account I managed on your behalf. You instructed me to use those dividends to purchase additional equity whenever retiring employees sold their stakes. Over 15 years, you acquired an additional 16%. He slid a single-page summary toward me. The numbers were clean, precise. Nauticonum. Total 51% controlling equity in Vanguard Steel Group Holdings. You are the majority shareholder, Vernon. You can call a special shareholder meeting at any time. You have the votes to remove the CEO, appoint new board members, restructure the entire company. I looked at the page. 51%. The number I'd been watching grow for 15 years, one quarterly dividend at a time, one retiring employee's stake at a time, 1% at a time, until it crossed the threshold that mattered. Harlan doesn't know, I said. Not a question. The equity is held through a trust structure. Vanguard is privately held, no SEC disclosure requirements for beneficial ownership. Your name doesn't appear on any company filings. Only I know. And now Clifford. And Thane signed away his claim to all of it this morning. Sterling allowed himself the smallest smile. Notarized and filed. Irrevocable. He stood, walked to his desk, opened a drawer. Pulled out a sealed manila envelope. Yellowed at the edges. 5 years old. DN test results. Sterling said, setting it on the table between us. You asked me to hold this 5 years ago. Told me not to let you open it until you asked. I looked at the envelope. My handwriting on the front, dated 2019. Inside was a truth I'd known was coming before I'd sent the samples to the lab. A truth I'd been sitting on like a grenade with the pin half pulled for 5 years. I didn't touch it. Not yet, I said. Sterling waited. Professional silence. The kind lawyers learn after 40 years of watching people make decisions that change everything. If I open it now, I said slowly, I will act out of anger. I don't want to act out of anger. What do you do with truth when using it right now? Would feel good, but waiting would make it matter. How long? Sterling asked. 90 days. Sterling didn't ask why. Didn't need to. He just nodded, picked up the envelope and placed it back in his desk drawer. Locked it. 90 days, he repeated. I stood, walked to the window, looked out at the Columbus skyline, the morning sun reflecting off glass buildings, the traffic moving below like blood through arteries. Somewhere out there, Harlan was in his corner office at Vanguard Steel, running a company he thought he controlled. I turned back to Sterling. I have to get to work, I said. 89 days left. He walked me to the door. We shook hands again. You've been patient for 15 years, Sterling said. 3 more months won't kill you. No, I said. But it might kill him. I took the elevator down, walked out into the July morning heat, got in my truck. The DNA envelope was back in Sterling's drawer where it had lived for 5 years unopened. I knew what was in it. Had known before I sent the samples. But knowing and proving are different things, and proving at the right moment is the difference between revenge and justice. 89 days. Then I'd open it. Then Harlan would learn what happened when you spent 12 years running a company you didn't actually own. Sterling asked the question I'd been asking myself for 5 years. If you know the truth that will end someone, why wait to use it? I sat across from him in that 12th floor office with the sealed envelope between us, yellowed at the edges, 5 years of patience folded inside a piece of paper I could open in 3 seconds. Because if I open it now, I said, I'll act out of anger. And I don't want to act out of anger. Sterling waited. 40 years of law practice teaches you when to let silence do the work. When I need it, I'll know. And when that moment comes, it won't be about what I feel. It'll be about what needs to happen. I picked up the envelope, felt the weight of it, set it back on the table and slid it toward Sterling. He took it without a word, opened his desk drawer, placed it inside, locked it. 89 days, I said. Sterling didn't ask what happens on day 90. He knew I'd tell him when it mattered. I stood, looked out the window at downtown Columbus, the buildings catching sun, the streets filling with people who had no idea what was about to shift in 3 months. I have to get to work. We shook hands. I took the elevator down, got in my truck, drove back to Vanguard Steel. You want to know the difference between a man who wants revenge and a man who wants justice. Revenge needs to happen now. Justice can wait 89 more days. Next morning I punched in at 5:54 a.m., same time as always. Same work overalls, same plastic thermos of coffee made at home in the dark. Harlan was in the plant manager's office when I walked through the bay doors. I saw him through the glass wall phone to his ear, and I watched the exact moment he spotted me on the shop floor. He froze. Phone still pressed to his ear, but his mouth stopped moving. He'd expected me to quit, disappear, break down, not walk back in like Tuesday never happened. I walked to my workstation, set down my thermos, pulled out my tool belt, strapped it on. Clifford was already at line B checking pressure gauges. Our eyes met for half a second. He nodded. I returned it. Harlan walked past my workstation at 6:14 a.m. Didn't say anything. Just walked past, slow enough that I could feel him watching. I was crouched by the air compressor, tightening the bolt I'd been working on when my son renounced me 2 days ago. I kept my head down, kept the wrench moving. 8 minutes later, he came back. Stopped 3 feet away. I could see his polished leather shoes in my peripheral vision. I didn't look up. He stood there for 20 seconds, then walked away. I finished with the compressor, wiped my hands on my coveralls, pulled out my notebook, opened it to a fresh page and wrote, date, time, temperature, machine B7 hydraulic pressure reading. All in my personal shorthand that looked like random maintenance observations to anyone who glanced over. Numbers that could be torque specs. Dates that could be service schedules. A maintenance log running for 15 years in a language only I could read. I wrote for 3 minutes, never looked up once. Then closed the notebook, slid it back in my pocket, and moved to the next machine. The man who'd walked out mid-shift Tuesday was back Wednesday acting like nothing had happened. Harlan stood in the workshop doorway at 9:30 a.m. Just stood there watching me work. I was lubricating the chain drive on line C, working the grease gun with steady pressure. 5 full minutes. I timed it without looking at my watch. Just counted the rhythm of my breathing, the pump of the grease gun, the seconds ticking past, while Harlan tried to figure out what kind of man gets publicly humiliated and shows up for work the next day like it was a weather report. Finally he moved, turned, walked toward the metal staircase to the 2nd floor. I watched him through the machinery, tracked his movement up the stairs across the catwalk into his glass-walled office overlooking the shop floor. He picked up his phone, made a call. 30 seconds later, I saw Thane walking across the parking lot. Thane entered through the main office entrance. 3 minutes later, he appeared in Harlan's office doorway. Harlan stood, gestured for Thane to come in, closed the door. Through the glass walls visible to anyone on the shop floor who cared to look up, Harlan spoke and gestured, pointed down toward the workshop floor, toward me. Thane stood with his arms crossed, listening, nodding. Harlan handed him a folder, spoke for another minute. Thane nodded again, took the folder, shook Harlan's hand. Clifford caught my eye from across the floor, raised an eyebrow. I gave him the smallest shake of my head. Not yet. Through the glass, Harlan pointed down at me. Thane nodded. They thought they were hunting. They had no idea I'd already won. Harlan was recruiting my son to investigate my finances, sending Thane to dig through records, bank accounts, asset histories, looking for the source of the money Harlan had accidentally revealed he knew about. The irony was so perfect it almost hurt. Thane had signed away all inheritance rights 48 hours ago. Legal, notarized, binding. He had zero claim to anything I owned, zero standing to contest anything I did, zero leverage in any fight over money. And Harlan was sending him to investigate the very inheritance he'd renounced. I went back to the grease gun, pumped it twice, checked the sprocket wear, wiped my hands, let them dig, let them both search. They'd find exactly what I wanted them to find, and nothing more. Thane walked out of Harlan's office carrying that folder like it was a treasure map. I went back to lubricating the chain drive on line C, watching them both through the glass, counting down the hours until they'd realized they were searching for something I'd already made sure they couldn't find. Clifford didn't ask if I had a plan. He asked when I was going to let him in on it. Afternoon break, 2:30 p.m. The workshop break room smelled like burnt coffee and machine oil. 3 other workers sat at the far table eating sandwiches from home, talking about the Reds game. Clifford and I sat in the corner near the vending machines. He set his coffee down, looked at me with the directness of a man who'd known me for 15 years and wasn't going to dance around it. "When were you going to tell me?" he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. The kind of question that wasn't really asking for information. It was asking for trust. I opened my work bag, pulled out 7 notebooks, set them on the table between us, numbered 1 through 7. The covers were worn edges, frayed pages, warped from being carried in my back pocket through summer heat and winter cold. "Now, 15 years, I said. Clifford picked up notebook 1, opened it, looked at the first page. Date, time, weather. Machine B7 hydraulic pressure inconsistent, reported twice, denied once. All written in my personal shorthand that looked like maintenance observations to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. He flipped through the pages, stopped at a random entry from 2011, read it for 30 seconds, closed the notebook, looked at me. "How much come?" he asked. "Everything," I said. "Every shift logged. Safety violations ignored. Materials diverted from inventory that never made it to the floor. Actual plant metrics versus officially reported figures. Worker complaints filed and buried. All of it." Clifford opened notebook 4, found an entry from 2016. His finger traced the shorthand, decoding it slowly. "This says Harlan approved cutting the ventilation budget by 40% and reported it as 15% to the board." "Yes. Jive. And this," he flipped forward 3 pages, "says he fired Raymond Hollis 3 weeks before pension vesting and listed the termination reason as performance when the actual reason was that Raymond asked for safety rails on the catwalk." "Yes." Clifford set the notebook down, looked at the stack of 7, looked at me. "Stite?" "Harlan asked about these once," I said. "About 3 years ago. Saw me writing during lunch break. Asked what I was doing. I told him I was just writing down machine quirks because I forget things. He laughed. Said that's what happens when you get old. Never asked again. 15 years of evidence in 7 notebooks weighs less than 5 pounds. Justice doesn't need to be heavy to break someone. What are you going to do with them? Clifford asked. When the time comes, I said, I'll know. He nodded. Didn't ask when that time would be. Just pushed the notebooks back across the table toward me and said, I'm with you. I put them back in my bag. We finished our break in silence. Went back to the floor at 2:45 p.m. and worked until the shift horn blew at 6 o'clock. I drove home, made dinner, microwaved leftover meatloaf and green beans, ate at the kitchen table with the notebook open beside my plate, writing the day's observations while I chewed. The phone rang at 8:17 p.m. Lorraine Ashford, 58 years old, my ex-wife. We'd been divorced for 12 years, separated for 14. She had a voice that could sound sweet when she wanted something. Shaw Vernon, she said when I answered. I heard about what happened with Thane. Are you okay? The practiced concern. The maternal warmth she'd never actually possessed when we were married, and Thane was young enough to need it. I'm fine, I said. It must have been so hard, she continued. Having him say those things in front of everyone. I just wanted to check on you. She was probing, trying to figure out if the $5 million Harlan had mentioned was real, trying to calculate whether the man she'd divorced for not making enough money had somehow accumulated a fortune she'd walked away from. I responded politely, didn't confirm, didn't deny. Let her fill the silence with assumptions. Well, if you need anything, she said after 3 minutes of careful questions that I answered with careful non-answers. You know where to find me. Thank you, Lorraine. I hung up, picked up my pen, wrote in the notebook Lorraine 8:17 p.m., beginning her calculations. Filed it the same way I'd filed everything for 15 years. The phone vibrated again at 8:30 p.m., unknown number. I stared at it for 3 rings. Picked up on the 4th. Hello. Uncle Vernon, it's Thane. Not Dad, not anymore. Uncle Vernon. The formality was a knife-deliberate distance, the family title you use when blood still connects you, but love doesn't. But the voice was different. Smaller somehow. The confidence that had carried him through the workshop 4 days ago, the certainty in his hand when he signed those papers, it wasn't there anymore. The man who called me a disgrace in front of 20 witnesses was calling me Uncle Vernon in the dark, and his voice cracked on both words. Thane, I said, kept my tone neutral, gave him nothing, silence on the other end. Not the comfortable silence of people who know each other, the uncertain silence of someone who'd rehearsed what to say and forgotten it all the moment the phone connected. He started, stopped, started again. Harlan asked me to look into some things. About your finances, honest at least. Or maybe just unsure enough that lying took more energy than he had. Did he? I said, not a question. Yeah. He mentioned he said there was money, that you had. Thane's voice trailed off. I just wanted to ask you about it. He was calling because Harlan told him to. I could hear it in every word. But something else was there too. Uncertainty. Hesitation. The boy who'd stood in that workshop and shredded paper with such confidence sounded like he didn't know what he was looking for anymore, or why he was looking at all. The hardest thing about the phone call wasn't hearing my son probe for information. It was hearing him pause mid-sentence to ask if I was okay. I wanted to explain, Thane was saying. His voice still had that uncertainty, like he was reading from a script he didn't quite believe. About the renunciation, it wasn't personal. It was just I needed to make a clean break. Start fresh. I held the phone, said nothing. Let the silence stretch. And Harlan mentioned, Thane stopped, started again. He said you had assets, from a patent or something. I just wanted to understand what. He stopped again. This time the pause was different. Longer. Are you okay? Thane asked. You've been coughing a lot lately. I noticed it a few weeks ago when you were... My hand tightened on the receiver. The concern in his voice was real. Brief, but real. Not the performance from the workshop floor. Not the script Harlan had given him. Just a son noticing his father's health and asking about it before he remembered he wasn't supposed to care. I swallowed, felt my throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the cough he'd mentioned. I'm fine, I said. Silence again. I could hear him breathing on the other end. Could almost see him in whatever apartment he was living in, now the expensive furniture bought with manager salary, the life he'd built away from the man who'd raised him. Do you need anything, Thane? First time I'd said his name to him in months, maybe years. Not son, not boy, not the kid. His name. He didn't answer for 3 seconds. When he spoke again, the script was back. The uncertainty replaced by the careful distance Harlan had probably coached him to maintain. That patent, Thane said. The one you sold for equity. How much money is left? And there it was. Back to business. Back to the investigation. Back to being the man Harlan needed him to be, instead of the son he'd been for 32 years. I hung up without answering. Set the phone down on the kitchen table. Looked at the photograph beside it, 7-year-old Thane on my shoulders at the company picnic, both of us smiling like we had all the time in the world. I turned the photograph face down. Not because I didn't want to see it, because I couldn't afford to. 2 days later, Ray Mercer sat in a suburban diner 15 miles outside Columbus, eating eggs and toast before his night shift at Vanguard. He was a press operator, late 40s, worked the machinery I serviced during day shift. We'd passed each other during rotation changes for 8 years, nodded hello, talked about weather and machine quirks, and nothing deeper than that. He recognized them both immediately. Lorraine Ashford sat in a corner booth near the back, wearing a navy blazer like she was meeting a lawyer. Harlan Prescott sat across from her, hands folded on the table, talking in the low, confident tone of a man who thought he was in control of the conversation. Ray was 2 booths away, close enough to see everything, too far to hear the words. He watched Harlan slide a folder across the table. Watched Lorraine open it, review the pages with the careful attention of someone reading a contract. She pulled a pen from her purse, signed the bottom of 3 separate pages, slid the folder back. They both nodded. Business partners closing a deal. Harlan's smile, Lorraine's satisfied expression. The handshake across the table that sealed whatever agreement they'd just made. Ray pulled out his phone, took a photo. The angle caught both of them clearly. Harlan's face, Lorraine's profile, the folder between them on the table. He texted it to Clifford with 3 words. Look who's meeting. Clifford forwarded it to me 11 minutes later. The text said, Lorraine and Harlan met this morning. Documents signed. Ray saw it at the diner on Route 33. I looked at the photo, zoomed in on the folder. Couldn't read the text from the angle, but I didn't need to. I knew what they were signing. Knew what Lorraine had calculated when she'd called me 3 nights ago with that practiced sweetness. She was joining Harlan's side, filing legal challenge to the waiver, claiming I'd coerced Thane, claiming the renunciation was invalid, claiming she had standing as Thane's mother to contest any inheritance distribution on his behalf. All of it predictable. All of it exactly what I'd known she would do the moment she heard about money she thought she'd walked away from. I typed 2 words back to Clifford, I know. Thanks. My phone buzzed within seconds. Clifford's response. How long have you known? I read the message. Set the phone down on the kitchen table without replying. Looked at it sitting there, screen still lit. Clifford's question, waiting for an answer I wasn't going to give. How long had I known? Since the moment Harlan mentioned $5 million and I saw Lorraine's future calculations light up behind her eyes. Clifford would be staring at his phone right now, waiting for the response. Realizing it wasn't coming, putting the pieces together on his own, realizing I'd been monitoring Lorraine's movements, watching Harlan's schedule, tracking both of them through contacts they didn't know existed. Ray Mercer at the diner. Others I'd never named. A network built over 15 years of quiet observation and careful trust. Clifford would understand eventually. I was always several moves ahead. Had been from the beginning. I'd been waiting for Lorraine and Harlan to meet. I'd been counting on it. Because every conversation they had, every document they signed, every plan they made together was another piece of evidence I didn't have to create myself. Let them conspire. Let them file their legal challenges. Let them think they were building a case against me. They were building my case for me. I picked up my pen, opened the notebook to a fresh page. Wrote Lorraine Ashford and Harlan Prescott, Route 33, Diner, 10:47 a.m. Legal conspiracy confirmed. Document signed. Ray Mercer witness. Another entry. Another fact. Another piece of the case they were building for me. 15 years of documentation. 15 years of patience. 86 days left until I showed them all exactly what patience could build. Clifford's unanswered question sat in my phone for 3 days. I didn't delete it. Just left it there, one more piece of documentation in a pile that had been growing for 15 years. The legal assistant's fingers stopped typing halfway through notebook. The legal assistant's fingers stopped typing. Halfway through notebook 3, looked up at Sterling, then back at the page like she'd misread something. She hadn't. Patricia Hayes, Sterling's senior legal assistant for 18 years, sat at the conference table with all 7 notebooks spread in front of her. She'd been transcribing my personal shorthand for 4 hours, translating 15 years of machinery observations into legal evidence. Her precision was the kind that understood every word could matter in court. She set down her pen, looked at Sterling across the table. "Han, this is," she started, stopped. Found her professional voice again. 23 safety violations that were never filed with OSHA, concealed from official reporting. Sterling leaned forward. "Show me." Patricia turned notebook 3 toward him, pointed to an entry from March 2017. My shorthand looked like maintenance notes about hydraulic pressure and temperature readings. To her, after 4 hours of decoding the pattern, it read differently. Ventilation failure in welding bay, 14 workers exposed to toxic fumes over 6 hours, incident suppressed from OSHA filing, reported internally as minor equipment malfunction. She flipped forward 10 pages. May 2017. Catwalk structural failure, 2 workers injured requiring medical treatment. OSHA filing listed as slip and fall accidents. No mention of structural cause. Sterling took the notebook. Read through 3 more entries. Set it down. Picked up notebook number 5. Found another pattern. "How many total?" he asked. Patricia consulted her typed summary. 23 concealed safety violations. 8 delayed injury reports filed outside the required 72-hour window. 3 severe accidents reclassified as minor incidents to avoid inspection triggers. Sterling closed the notebook. Looked at me across the conference table. "With this file," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years, reading documents that changed lives, "this isn't a civil matter anymore." "I know," I said. "That's why I logged them. Every shift. 15 years. You want to know the difference between documentation and evidence. Documentation is what you keep for yourself. Evidence is what makes a prosecutor lean forward in their chair. 1 week later, workshop break room after night shift. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The coffee machine dripped into a pot that had been burning the same batch since 2 p.m. Clifford and I sat in the corner booth away from the vending machines. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, set it on the table between us. 3 men, Clifford said. Fired over the past 2 years for what Harlan called disciplinary violations. I waited. Just all three filed internal OSHA complaints before termination. All three were let go within a week of signing the paperwork. He unfolded the paper. 3 names written in his careful handwriting. 3 addresses. 3 phone numbers. Forrest Redmond, safety complaint about machine guarding. Fired 6 days later for attendance issues. Dennis Kowalski, complaint about ventilation in paint booth. Terminated 4 days later for insubordination. Gerald Becker, complaint about emergency exit obstruction. Fired 8 days later for performance review failure. I pulled out my notebook, wrote down all 3 names, all 3 addresses. 3 men who'd tried to do the right thing and lost everything for it. Pattern of retaliation, Clifford said, not a question. Yes, I said. I looked at the 3 names in my handwriting. Looked at Clifford. Are they still willing to testify? Clifford's answer came without hesitation. They've been waiting for someone to ask. 2 weeks after that, Sterling's office. August heat making the 12th floor windows sweat condensation. Sterling sat behind his desk with a court filing in his hands, reading it for the 2nd time. Lorraine filed suit this morning, he said. Seeking share of your stock equity based on marital asset language in the original divorce decree. I sat across from him, waited. She's claiming the equity was acquired during marriage through patent development you conducted, while married, making it divisible marital property. Sterling set down the filing, pulled out a different folder, opened it to show documentation I'd signed 15 years ago. Your equity originated from a patent held solely in your name. Independent intellectual property. Separate property under Ohio Revised Code Section 3105.171, not marital asset. She has no legal standing. How long? I asked. I'll file a motion to dismiss in 2 to 3 weeks. Her claim falls apart under Ohio law. The patent predates the marriage and was never a joint asset. Final ruling takes months, but she won't touch your equity. The law is clear. Sterling paused, looked at the filing again. His expression shifted slightly. Who did she hire? I asked. Sterling turned the document toward me, pointed to the attorney name printed across the bottom letterhead. Harlan's personal attorney. Harlan's personal attorney. They weren't just meeting in diners anymore. They were sharing lawyers. I nodded. Of course. Sterling set down the court filing. The names stared up at us from the bottom of the page. They're coordinating now, Sterling said. This isn't coincidence anymore. Harlan is funding her legal attack, probably coaching strategy, using his attorney to maintain deniability while directing her case. I looked at the name, looked at Sterling, felt something settle in my chest that had been waiting to settle for weeks. Good, I said. Sterling raised an eyebrow. Let them coordinate, I continued. Let them share attorneys and strategies and assumptions about what I have and what I don't. I picked up the filing, looked at Harlan's attorney's name one more time, set it back on the desk. Because every document they file, every motion they make, every conversation they have with shared counsel, they're building my case for me. Sterling understood, had understood from the beginning. That's why he'd been my attorney for 15 years. They thought they were attacking. They were confessing. Every document they filed together was another confession. Sterling knew it. I knew it. But Harlan and Lorraine, sharing that same attorney, thought they were building an attack. Harlan Prescott stood in his glass office watching me work for 5 full minutes without moving once, and I knew exactly what he was calculating. Why wasn't I gone yet? Week 6. August heat making the workshop floor feel like working inside an oven. I was replacing worn bearings on the conveyor drive hands covered in grease wrench, turning in the steady rhythm I'd maintained for 43 years. Above me, through the glass walls of the 2nd floor office, Harlan stood motionless, watching, not pretending to do anything else, just watching. I counted in my head while I worked. 5 minutes, 6, 7. He couldn't figure it out. The maintenance worker he'd watched get publicly humiliated by his own son should have quit, should have disappeared, should have broken down or fought back or done something other than show up every morning at 5:54 a.m. and work like nothing had happened. But I was still here, still calm, still writing in my notebook during breaks like I had been for 15 years. It was eating at him. At 8 minutes, he moved, picked up his office phone, made a call. 30 seconds later, I saw Thane walking across the parking lot toward the building. Thane entered through the main office door, climbed the stairs to the second floor, appeared in Harlan's office doorway. Harlan gestured him in, closed the door. The glass walls showed everything. Harlan spoke rapidly, gesturing with his hands, pulled documents from his desk drawer, spread them across his conference table, pointed at specific pages. Thane leaned over them, nodding eager, pulled out his phone, took photos of pages, made notes. Harlan handed Thane a folder, spoke for another 2 minutes. Thane nodded again, shook Harlan's hand, left. The entire conversation visible through glass walls. Every gesture, every document exchange, every instruction Harlan thought was private. Clifford walked past my workstation, glanced up at Harlan's office, then at me, raised an eyebrow. I kept my wrench moving, mouthed 2 words, "Not yet." You want to know when a predator realizes the prey has teeth, when it hears conflict of interest from the lawyer it thought was neutral. 2 days later, Sterling called me at 11:30 a.m. I was on my lunch break, sitting in my truck in the parking lot with a sandwich and the notebook open on my lap. "Your son came to my office this morning," Sterling said. No greeting, no preamble, just facts. I set down my pen, listened. Ton Harlan sent him. Thane booked a consultation appointment under his own name. Came in asking about a reputable corporate equity lawyer to help investigate what he called a hidden 35% equity stake held by an unnamed shareholder. 35%. The number from public records when I'd done the original patent-to-equity swap. The number that had been sitting in company filings for 15 years. The number Harlan had finally found. But not the real number, not 51%. Just the old trail. "What did you tell him?" I asked. And I listened, took notes, asked clarifying questions like I was considering the case. Then I declined representation. On what grounds? "To conflict of interest." Sterling's voice carried the weight of a man who'd practiced law for 40 years and knew exactly what those 3 words would communicate. I gave no further explanation. He seemed very frustrated, left after 15 minutes. I could picture it. Thane sitting in Sterling's conference room with all his documentation and instructions from Harlan, walking Sterling through the investigation he wanted conducted, thinking he'd found the perfect attorney to help him dig into his father's hidden assets. And Sterling sitting there listening to every word, taking notes that would go directly into my file, then declining with 2 words that revealed everything and nothing at once. "He called someone from his car," Sterling continued. "I was standing near my office window." His voice carried. He said, and I quote, "Conflict of interest means he's already representing someone else." Then he said your name. I smiled, didn't mean to, couldn't help it. "Harlan knows now," Sterling said. "Good," I said. I hung up. Went back to my sandwich. Wrote in the notebook Thane visited Sterling 11 a.m. Harlan investigating 35% equity. Sterling declined conflict of interest revealed. Harlan now knows I have representation. Wrote it down and closed the notebook. The case was building itself. Later that day, Harlan's behavior changed. He paced his glass office for an hour. Made 6 phone calls I could count from the workshop floor below. Stood at his window looking out at the city skyline instead of down at the machinery. The confidence was cracking. The smile was gone. He'd thought he was dealing with a maintenance worker who'd gotten lucky with a patent sale. $5 million. Maybe a bit more if the royalties had been good. Enough to make Harlan nervous, but not enough to make him afraid. But conflict of interest meant I had an attorney who handled corporate equity stakes. The kind of attorney you didn't hire for $5 million in cash. The kind of attorney you hired when the assets were complex enough, large enough, sophisticated enough, to require that level of expertise. Harlan had been hunting a rabbit, and just realized he'd been tracking a wolf. I watched him through the glass walls, watched him pick up his phone again, set it down, pick it up, make another call. His shoulders were tight, his movements sharp instead of smooth. Clifford appeared beside my workstation, didn't say anything, just stood there looking up at Harlan's office. "He's recalculating," I said quietly. Clifford nodded. Realizing the $5 million was just the beginning. "Beginning to suspect it," I said. "Not there yet, but getting close. How long until he figures it out?" I tightened the bolt I'd been working on, set down my wrench, looked up at Harlan pacing behind glass. "He won't figure it out," I said. "He'll be told, when the time is right." I watched Harlan make another call, watched him gesture at whoever was on the other end, watched the specific tension in his posture that came from realizing the numbers didn't add up the way he thought they did. Sterling's rejection had told him three things. I had representation, that representation was expensive, and that representation handled corporate equity stakes large enough to create conflicts of interest. The $5 million he'd been so confident about mentioning on the workshop floor 3 weeks ago, that number was starting to feel very small. Let him recalculate. Every new number would be wrong in a different way. Harlan was chasing 35% when I controlled 51%. Every calculation he ran would produce the wrong answer. Every move he made would be based on numbers that were 15 years out of date. Celeste Travers, OSHA compliance officer for 12 years, had seen a lot of worker complaints cross her desk. But she'd never seen 15 years of daily field logs written in personal shorthand and cross-referenced against official filings like a prosecutor's case file. Week 7. Sterling and I sat across from her in the Columbus regional office. Gray carpet, fluorescent lights, the institutional smell of government buildings everywhere. 3 filing boxes sat on the floor beside my chair. 7 notebooks transcribed into typed reports sat on her desk. Travers was 50 efficient, the kind of professional who'd spent over a decade reading complaints and knowing which ones had teeth and which ones were just noise. She picked up the first transcribed notebook, flipped through it, set it down. Picked up the cross-reference document Patricia Hayes had prepared. She read for 4 minutes without speaking. Then she stopped, looked up at Sterling, at me. 15 years of field logs, she said. Her voice was careful, professional. Cross-referenced against official OSHA filings submitted by Vanguard Steel. This is evidence we rarely see. I know, I said. That's why it took 15 years to gather it. She picked up another document. The list of concealed violations Patricia had compiled. 23 incidents, 8 delayed injury reports, 3 severe accidents reclassified to avoid inspection triggers. You logged every shift, Travers said, not a question. Every shift, I confirmed. She set down the document, looked at Sterling. We will open a formal investigation, she said. Full workplace safety audit. Interviews with current and former employees. Document review. If we find signs of criminal conduct, intentional concealment, falsification, of records, retaliation against complainants, this goes to the Department of Justice. Department of Justice. She said it like a destination, not a possibility. Sterling nodded. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, and watched 15 years of documentation become a criminal investigation in a government office on a Tuesday afternoon. Timeline? Sterling asked. Initial review takes 3 weeks. If criminal referral is warranted, we'll notify DOJ within 30 days of completing our audit. I did the math in my head. 3 weeks plus 30 days, 7 weeks total. We were already in late August. That put us at mid-October. 63 days left until my 90-day timeline. The numbers were lining up. We left the OSHA office at 3 p.m., drove back through Columbus traffic. Sterling dropped me at my truck in the parking lot near his office building. "It's in motion now," he said. "Yes," I said. I drove to Vanguard Steel for the second half of my shift. Punched in at 3:47 p.m. Went back to work like I'd been on a long lunch break instead of filing a federal workplace safety complaint that would end a CEO's career. 1 week later, my phone buzzed at 10:47 p.m. Text from Clifford Harlan called Thane in. Late. Just the two of them. Documents. I was sitting in my kitchen with the notebook open. Set down my pen. Texted back. "What kind of documents?" Clifford can't tell from outside. Stack of papers. Thane signing. Not reading closely. Trusting. I stared at the phone, typed "keep watching." 10 minutes later, still signing, page after page. Harlan pointing where to sign. Thane nodding. I called Sterling. He answered on the second ring. "Lot Harlan's got Thane in his office at 11 at night," I said. "Having him sign documents. Clifford's watching through the glass." Sterling was quiet for 3 seconds. "I'll make some calls. See what I can find out." He called back the next morning at 7:30 a.m. I was in my truck in the Vanguard parking lot 7 minutes before my shift. "Those documents tie to accounting fraud from 2 years ago," Sterling said. His voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen this move before and knew exactly what it meant. "Vendor invoicing irregularities. Payments to shell companies. Thane's signature is now on the paper trail." "Scapegoat," I said. "Yes. If federal investigators ever look at those transactions, Thane's name is there. Harlan's creating distance, building a liability shield." I hung up. Sat in my truck for the remaining 4 minutes before shift started. Thought about Thane signing page after page at 11 at night, trusting the man he thought was mentoring him, not knowing he was being positioned as the fall guy for crimes committed before he even had access to the accounts. You want to know what it looks like when a man throws his own son under a bus to save himself? It looks like a smile in a glass office at 9:15 on a Wednesday morning. I watched Harlan through the glass walls. He sat at his desk reviewing documents. The same documents Thane had signed 2 nights earlier. Harlan picked up one page, examined Thane's signature, set it down, picked up another, examined that signature too. Then he smiled. First time in weeks. Small, satisfied. The expression of a man who thought he'd solved a problem. He thought he'd built a shield. Thought Thane's name on those papers meant protection. Meant if federal investigators ever came asking about accounting irregularities from 2 years ago, there would be someone else's signature to point at. Someone young, someone inexperienced, someone who could plausibly have made mistakes without understanding the implications. Harlan leaned back in his chair, looked out the window at the city skyline. The tension in his shoulders was gone. The pacing had stopped. He didn't know federal investigators were already asking questions, just not about the fraud he'd prepared for. They were asking about 23 safety violations, 8 concealed injuries, 3 men who'd been fired for filing complaints. He didn't know OSHA had opened a formal investigation. Didn't know DOJ referral was likely within 60 days. Didn't know every move he made was being documented and would be used against him in ways he couldn't predict. He'd just sacrificed his own biological son, the one he didn't know was his son, to create a liability shield that wouldn't protect him from the investigation that was actually coming. I went back to my workstation, picked up my wrench, started on the next machine in my checklist. 15 years of patience, 63 days left. And Harlan Prescott sitting in his glass office thinking he'd won. Harlan had prepared for one investigation while OSHA was conducting another. He'd built defenses against questions nobody was asking while the questions that mattered were already being answered in government offices and living rooms across Columbus. The three men sitting in Dennis Kowalski's living room had been fired for telling the truth, and they'd been waiting 2 years for someone with enough power to care. Clifford and I arrived at 6:30 p.m. on a Thursday. Dennis's house was a small ranch in the Columbus suburbs, the kind of place you buy when you have a steady paycheck and reasonable expectations about the future. The living room had cream-colored walls and family photos. 3 men sat on mismatched furniture around a coffee table covered in documents. Dennis Kowalski stood when we entered. Former quality control inspector, late 40s, handshake firm but wary. He'd spent 6 years at Vanguard before Harlan terminated him for culture mismatch. Filed internal OSHA complaint on March 14th. Dennis said, sliding papers across his coffee table. Terminated March 21st. 7 days. He handed me the complaint. Dated, stamped by HR, signature verified. Then the termination letter. Same dates. No explanation beyond the phrase, culture mismatch with company values. Gerald Becker sat in the armchair by the window. Assembly line maintenance for 6 years, early 50s, the kind of quiet competence you find in men who've worked with their hands their whole lives. Same pattern, Gerald said. Filed my complaint April 9th, gone April 16th. He slid his documents across the table. Performance issues, they said. No prior warnings, no documentation. Just gone. Martin Fletcher was the youngest, 32, sitting on the couch with his hands folded. He'd believed reporting broken safety equipment was the right thing to do until Harlan proved him wrong by firing him 7 days after he filed. June 3rd to June 10th, Martin said. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd learned a hard lesson about how the world actually worked. I thought they'd fix the ventilation. Instead, they fixed me. I pulled out my notebook. Opened it to entries from March, April, June of the previous years. Found Dennis's complaint logged the day he filed it. Gerald's complaint. Martin's complaint. All documented in my shorthand the same day they'd submitted them to HR. We waited 2 years, Dennis said. He looked at me directly. Nobody asked. Nobody with authority cared enough to ask. You want to know what retaliation looks like when it's systematic. It looks like 3 men, 3 complaints, 3 terminations, all exactly 7 days apart. I wrote down everything. The dates, the complaint details, the termination reasons. Every document they had, I logged in my notebook with the same methodical attention I'd been using for 15 years. Clifford sat quietly beside me, watching, understanding that this moment was what all those years of documentation had been building toward. Martin shifted in his seat, looked at the other 2 men, back at me. Mr. Caldwell, he said quietly, do you know about Forrest Redmond? I stopped writing, looked up. I'm a warehouse worker, Martin continued. About 40 years old, worked loading dock for 8 years. Last year, Dennis picked up the story. Forrest broke his spine when the handrail gave way on the loading dock stairs. That handrail had been reported broken for 3 months. Nobody fixed it. I flipped back through my notebook. Found the entry. March 17th, a year ago. Loading dock stairs, east side handrail loose at base, structural integrity. Compromised, reported to maintenance supervisor, request for repair, submitted request, denied due to budget constraints. My handwriting, my observations, my report that went nowhere. Harlan logged the accident as a personal slip and fall, Gerald said. Claimed Forrest wasn't holding the rail properly. Delayed the OSHA report for 6 weeks. By the time workers' compensation reviewed it, the delay made them question the severity. They denied full coverage. Forrest's in a wheelchair part-time now, Martin said. His family's drowning in medical debt, physical therapy costs, home modifications, lost wages. I wrote down Forrest's name, underlined it once, then twice. My hand was shaking, just slightly, just enough that the second underline wasn't as straight as the first. 15 years of documentation. 15 years of watching safety violations get ignored, watching complaints get buried, watching good people get hurt by a system that prioritized profit over protection. And Forrest Redmond had broken his spine because of a handrail I'd specifically documented as dangerous 3 months before he fell. I'd logged that handrail failure in notebook number 4. March 17th. Reported broken. Request denied. Forrest fell June 23rd. I'd known for 3 months it would hurt someone. I just hadn't known who. The 3 men watched me write. Watched my hand shake. Didn't say anything. They understood what this meant. They'd been broken by the same system, just in different ways. Clifford put his hand on my shoulder for half a second. Removed it. That was enough. I closed the notebook deliberately. Stood up. My voice was steady even though my hands weren't. Clifford, I said. I need Forrest's phone number and address. Now. Dennis pulled a slip of paper from his pocket. Unfolded it. The creases suggested it had been folded and unfolded many times. He's been hoping someone would ask, Dennis said. He handed me the paper. Phone number. Address in East Columbus. Written in careful block letters like someone who wanted to make sure the information would be readable whenever it was finally needed. I pulled out a fresh page in my notebook. Wrote down Forrest's contact information. My handwriting was steadier than my hand. Force of 15 years of practice. Muscle memory taking over when emotion tried to interfere. Forrest Redmond, 40. Warehouse worker, spine injury, handrail failure. 3 months warning ignored. 6 weeks delay in reporting. Workers' comp denied. Medical debt. Wheelchair. The 3 men watched me write. Watched me underline Forrest's address, twice the same way I'd underlined his name. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was personal. One of my own had been broken by the system I'd been documenting for 15 years. Broken by a danger I'd specifically identified and watched get ignored broken while I wrote in notebooks and waited for the right moment to act. 48 days left until my 90-day timeline. 48 days until the shareholders' meeting. 48 days until Harlan Prescott learned what accountability looked like when the person holding you accountable had been planning it for 15 years. But first I was going to visit Forrest Redmond. Forrest Redmond wasn't just documentation anymore. He was the reason the next 48 days would matter more than the 15 years before them. And I was going to start by doing the one thing documentation couldn't do. Forrest Redmond's house had a wheelchair ramp I hadn't noticed in the address Dennis gave me, and the smell of medicine came through the screen door before anyone answered my knock. Small ranch house, East Columbus. Grass needed cutting, but someone had tried to keep it neat. The ramp was new wood recently built, probably by family or friends, because the construction wasn't quite professional. Sarah Redmond answered the door. 40, exhausted in the way that comes from being caregiver, breadwinner, and debt manager all at once. She looked at me with the wariness of someone who'd learned that strangers at the door usually brought bad news or collection notices. Mrs. Redmond, I said. My name is Vernon Caldwell. I worked with Forrest at Vanguard. I was wondering if I could talk to him for a few minutes. She studied my face. Looked at my work clothes, the grease still under my fingernails from the morning shift. Recognized something. Come in, she said. Forrest sat in his wheelchair in the living room, where family photos showed a different man. One who could stand, who coached Little League, who didn't know what a broken handrail would cost him. He was 40, had the build of someone who'd worked physical labor his whole life, and his handshake was still strong, even though his legs no longer worked the way they used to. "I'm Vernon," he said. "I remember you. Maintenance. You fixed the press I worked 3 years ago." "I remember," I said. I sat down. Didn't mention the lawsuit, didn't mention the accident, didn't mention anything about why I was really there. "Tell me about your kids," I said. "What are they like?" We talked for 45 minutes. Baseball. Fishing. The Little League team Forrest had coached before the accident. His daughter's piano recital. His son's science fair project. The kind of conversation you have when you're just two men who work the same floor and happen to cross paths. Sarah brought coffee, sat with us. Started to relax when she realized I wasn't there to serve papers or collect debt. When I stood to leave, I pulled an envelope from my jacket pocket. Set it on their coffee table. "That's 6 months of medical expenses," I said. "From my personal savings, not from any company, not connected to any legal case. You owe me nothing." Forrest looked at the envelope, at me, started to speak. "If you don't take it, I'll just leave it here," I said. I was out the door before he could form a response. I sat in my truck outside his house for 7 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, looking at the wheelchair ramp, thinking about a handrail I'd logged as broken in notebook number 4 3 months before it finally gave way. Opened my notebook, wrote day 71/90. I'd logged a handrail failure. Forrest broke his spine 3 months later. The envelope on his table wouldn't fix his back, but it was the only thing I could fix right now. Before I tell you how those final 19 days unfolded, are you still with me? Comment A, if you think helping Forrest was strategy, or B, if it was pure compassion, and tell me why in exactly 5 words. Because this next part includes some fictionalized details added for emotional depth. But the lesson behind it is what matters. That same evening, Sterling's office, conference room with the video screen set up for remote participants. Celeste Travers appeared on the left half of the screen from the OSHA regional office. Wade Garrison, 45, FBI special agent assigned to corporate fraud and workplace safety crimes, appeared on the right half, with the professional calm of someone who'd spent 20 years building federal cases that didn't fall apart in court. Sterling sat at the head of the conference table. I sat to his right. Papers spread between us. 19 days until the shareholder meeting, Sterling said. Vernon's 51% controlling stake allows him to convene it and set the agenda. Harlan Prescott will suspect nothing until he sits down in that boardroom. Travers nodded on the screen. OSHA criminal referral has been officially transferred to the Department of Justice. Agent Garrison is handling the investigation from here. Garrison spoke for the first time. His voice was measured, professional. Grand jury subpoena for Harlan Prescott is prepared. We'll serve it after your board procedure concludes to avoid any claims of interference with corporate governance. Clean separation. Timeline on the subpoena, Sterling asked. 24 hours after your meeting, Garrison said. Assuming you convene as scheduled. I spoke for the first time since the video call started. One more thing. I want to purchase 14 new safety gear sets for the shop floor, from my personal account. Delivered before the meeting. Sterling looked at me. Garrison said nothing. Travers's expression didn't change. I'll arrange it, Sterling said simply. You want to know when you stop waiting and start acting, when you've got 19 days left and a grand jury subpoena with someone's name on it. The video call ended. Travers and Garrison signed off. The screen went dark. Sterling and I sat alone in the conference room. He looked at me across the table. His voice went quiet. Now about that envelope, Vernon, he said. The one I've held for 5 years. I sat still for a moment. Looked out the window at Columbus in the late afternoon light. The buildings casting long shadows. Traffic moving through streets like blood through arteries. 19 days until everything I'd built for 15 years came together in one boardroom. 19 days until Harlan Prescott learned what 51% really meant. 19 days until my son discovered who his biological father actually was. I looked back at Sterling. "Bring it out," I said. "It's time." Sterling opened his desk drawer, pulled out the envelope that had lived there untouched for 5 years, yellowed at the edges. My handwriting on the front. The DNA test results I'd asked him to hold, because opening them too early would have made me act from anger instead of strategy. He set it on the conference table between us. Still sealed. 19 days left. The envelope was coming open. The rest would follow. Sterling set the envelope on the conference table. 91 days since July 8th. 19 days until the shareholder meeting. 19 days until everything I'd built came together. And this envelope sealed for 5 years was about to tell me something I already knew but had never let myself confirm. The envelope wasn't sealed with glue. It was sealed with 5 years of restraint. I picked it up, felt the weight of it, yellowed at the edges. Lab postmark from 2019. My handwriting on the front, DNA analysis, hold until requested. Sterling watched me across the table, said nothing, just waited. I broke the seal. The sound was crisp, clean. 5 years of wondering ending in one motion. Pulled out the lab report. 3 pages. Clinical language, probability percentages, genetic markers, the kind of document that reduces human relationships to numbers and science. I read the conclusion aloud. Not because Sterling needed to hear it, because saying it made it real. DNA analysis confirms with 99.997% probability that Harlan Prescott is the biological father of Thane Caldwell. Sterling leaned back in his chair. His expression didn't change. He'd probably suspected this the moment I asked him to hold the envelope 5 years ago. "Why did you wait?" he asked. 5 years, Vernon. You've known this test existed. Why not open it? I set down the report, looked at Sterling. Because if I'd opened it the day I received it, I would have acted out of anger, I said. I would have told Thane immediately, and he would have been destroyed. Destroyed. A boy learns his father isn't his father, I said. That his real father is his boss, that his mother never told him that everything he thought he knew about his family was a lie. A boy would have blamed everyone, would have seen himself as a victim, would have spent the rest of his life angry at people who were trying to protect him. I picked up the report again, looked at the numbers. The clinical certainty of genetics. Study. But a man, I continued. A man who spent years watching Harlan Prescott operate, watching him crush people for profit, watching him prioritize money over safety, watching him manipulate and control and discard anyone who doesn't serve his purposes, that man can handle the truth. Because he's already seen who his biological father really is. Sterling understood. I watched it settle in his expression. Thane needed to discover Harlan's character through his own experience, I said. Not through me telling him. He needed to see the cruelty, the calculation, the complete absence of empathy. He needed to know who Harlan was before he learned what Harlan was. I reached into the envelope, pulled out a second document. Older, more fragile. Thane's original birth certificate. The one filed with the state of Ohio 32 years ago. Father unknown. Lorraine had never listed Harlan's name. Never connected her son to the Prescott family. Never gave Harlan the opportunity to claim or reject or manipulate. She'd protected Thane the only way she could, by erasing Harlan from his official existence. A boy would have been destroyed by this, I said, setting the birth certificate beside the DNA report. A man can survive it. Thane earned the right to know this truth by becoming a man who won't be crushed by it. Sterling nodded slowly. 19 days, he said. 19 days, I confirmed. I left Sterling's office at 7 p.m., drove home through evening traffic, pulled into my driveway, sat in the truck for 3 minutes before going inside. What do you do the night before you reveal a truth that destroys a son's understanding of his own blood? I sat alone in my small living room the night before the boardroom meeting. No anxiety, no rehearsal, no last-minute preparations. On the coffee table sat a photograph from 1999. Thane, at 7 years old, standing next to me at a Vanguard Steel Employee Family Day. He was holding a hot dog, grinning at the camera, wearing a company t-shirt 3 sizes too big. I was in my maintenance coveralls, hand on his shoulder. I remembered that day. Remembered him asking why I didn't sit with the important people at the manager's table. Because the important conversations happen right here. I'd told him. 7-year-old Thane had accepted that answer, believed it. Stayed with me at the maintenance workers' table and ate hot dogs and talked about baseball. Tomorrow the tables would turn. I set my alarm for 5 a.m., not for a maintenance shift, for a boardroom entrance. On my kitchen table, I placed 3 objects in a row. My reading glasses, the DNA envelope, my Vanguard Steel ID badge, 3 objects that told the complete story. The worker who could read documents, the truth that changed everything, the identity that was about to shift from invisible to undeniable. No whiskey, no television, no phone calls, just quiet preparation. I walked to my bedroom, the same bed I'd slept in through 40 years of night shifts, the same alarm clock that had woken me at 5 a.m. for 4 decades. But tomorrow I wouldn't be punching a clock. Tomorrow I'd be walking through the executive entrance. You'd think a man would rehearse his words, practice the speech. But I'd been rehearsing for 33 years, every time I showed up for Thane when he didn't want me there. Every time I paid for something he needed and let him think he'd earned it himself. Every time I stayed quiet when he called me an embarrassment. Every time I wrote in my notebook instead of fighting back. 33 years of loving someone who wouldn't let me love them the easy way. I lay down, closed my eyes, let my last thought settle in the dark. Thane, you're about to learn that blood doesn't make you a son. Love does. The alarm screamed at 5 a.m. I silenced it with one finger. For 40 years, that sound meant punching a clock. Today, it meant claiming a boardroom. I got dressed in the gray suit I'd bought 8 years ago for a friend's funeral. Never worn it to work. Never had a reason to walk through the front doors of Vanguard Steel as anything other than a maintenance worker in coveralls. The elevator to the 9th floor doesn't require a badge swipe if you own 51% of the building. I arrived at 7:40 a.m., 20 minutes early. The boardroom was empty. Glass walls overlooking the entire plant floor below. Mahogany conference table that seated 16. I remembered installing that table in 2003, remembered polishing the underside of it where nobody would ever look. I walked the perimeter, ran my hand along the edge. Solid construction. Good joinery. We'd done it right 21 years ago. The chairman's seat was at the head of the table. High-backed leather. The kind of chair that costs more than a month of my salary. I pulled it out, sat down. The view from this seat showed everything. The workshop floor 9 stories below. The parking lot. The loading docks. The places I'd worked for 43 years now visible through glass that had always kept me on the other side. Sterling arrived at 7:43 a.m., walked in without knocking. Stood by the door with his briefcase. You ready? He asked. Mom, been ready for 33 years, I said. The board members started arriving at 7:45 a.m., one by one. Each walking in expecting a normal quarterly meeting. Each stopping when they saw me sitting at the head of the table. Eleanor Voss entered first. CFO, mid-50s, efficient in the way that comes from 20 years of corporate finance. She recognized me. I'd seen that recognition in her face, the slight pause, the mental calculation of why the maintenance worker from safety briefings was sitting in the chairman's seat. She said nothing. Just took her usual seat 3 chairs down on the right side. Opened her folder. Corporate decorum prevailing over confusion. Marcus Dunn came next. Operations director, late 40s. He'd seen me on the plant floor for decades but never knew my name. He looked at me, looked at Eleanor. She gave him nothing. He sat down across from her. Rita Calderon followed. General counsel, early 60s corporate lawyer, who'd ridden elevators with me hundreds of times without ever speaking. She glanced at me, at Sterling standing by the door, and something shifted in her expression. A lawyer's recognition that something formal was happening. 3 more board members filed in. Same pattern, recognition, confusion, silence. I nodded at each as they entered. Said, "Good morning." Some nodded back. Some didn't. Marcus leaned toward Eleanor, whispered, "That's Vernon from machinery maintenance." "Why is he at the head?" Eleanor whispered back. Neither asked me directly. Corporate hierarchy had rules. You didn't question someone sitting in the chairman's seat even if you didn't understand why they were there. You'd think revenge would feel hot. But 40 years of waiting teaches you real power is cold. At exactly 8 a.m., the boardroom door opened. Harlan Prescott walked in mid-sentence, talking to Thane about quarterly projections. "And make sure the union grievance gets buried in..." He stopped. Mid-word, mid-step, mid-thought. His eyes scanned the room casually, the way you do when you enter a space you've controlled for 12 years. Then, they landed on me, sitting at the head of the table. 3 seconds. I watched it happen in slow motion. First-second recognition. The maintenance worker. The man who'd worked the floor for 4 decades. Second confusion. Why is he wearing a suit? Why is he here? Third-second calculation. Sterling standing by the door. Board members already seated. Me in the chairman's seat. Fourth-second horror. Thane stood behind him in the doorway, looking between me and Harlan. Lost. "Dad," Thane said. "What's wrong?" Harlan didn't answer. Just stared at me. His face had gone pale. The confident smile he'd worn walking into the room had evaporated. The boardroom was silent. No one moved. The kind of silence that forms when everyone knows something significant is happening, but nobody understands what yet. Thane still didn't know. I was about to destroy his father in front of him. Sterling stepped forward. His voice carried the weight of 40 years of legal practice. Professional, formal, undeniable. "Allow me to introduce Vernon Caldwell," Sterling said. 51% controlling shareholder of Vanguard Steel Group Holdings. Your new chairman of the board effective today. The silence deepened. Became something physical. Something you could feel pressing against your skin. Eleanor's folder slipped from her hands. Landed on the table with a soft thud. Marcus's mouth opened slightly. Closed. Opened again. Rita sat perfectly still, but her eyes moved from me to Sterling to Harlan in the precise calculation of a lawyer watching liability materialize in real time. Harlan found his voice. It came out wrong, higher than normal, strained. "This is impossible," he said. "He's a shop floor hand. I know every shareholder. I've reviewed every..." "Sit down, Harlan," I said. My voice was level, calm. The same tone I'd used for 40 years when reporting machinery problems to supervisors who didn't want to hear them. "I have a lot to present," I continued. Harlan didn't sit. Just stood there in the doorway, Thane behind him, both of them frozen, while the board members processed what Sterling had just said. 51% controlling shareholder, new chairman, effective today. I reached for the manila folder in front of me, opened it with deliberate care. Inside were documents I'd organized 15 years ago, copies I'd made, records I'd kept. Evidence I'd been building while everyone thought I was just a maintenance worker writing in a notebook. The first page was dated March 2019. I looked up at Harlan, at Thane, at the board members sitting around the table. "Let's begin with March 2019, I said. The first document explained how a maintenance worker inherited a company. The next 47 explained what its CEO had stolen. I slid the letter across the mahogany table. March 14th, 2019, from Sterling Holbrook, then representing Grady Whitmore's estate. My voice carried across the silent boardroom. Grady left me 51% of Vanguard Steel, not as charity, as payment for what this company was built on my patents, my innovations, my 15 years of silence, while better men pretended my work was theirs. Harlan's face had gone the color of old concrete. Thane stared at the letter like it might burst into flames. "That's how a maintenance worker becomes majority shareholder." I continued. "Now let me show you what a CEO becomes when nobody's watching." I opened the first evidence binder. June 2019. OSHA inspection delayed 48 hours after you received advance notice from Gerald Voss, your college roommate who works in their regional office. I placed the email chain in front of Darcy Hollins. During those 48 hours, 3 temporary safety rails appeared in Building 4. They were removed June 23rd. I have photographs. Darcy's expression didn't change, but her pen moved faster across her legal pad. August 2019. Contract bid for Midwest Industrial submitted at $4.2 million. I laid out 2 documents side by side. Competing bid from Hammond Metals submitted at $3.8. Hammond was awarded the contract. 2 weeks later, Hammond subcontracted the work back to Vanguard for $4 million. Harlan Prescott received a consulting fee of $80,000 from Hammond's parent company. 3 board members leaned forward simultaneously. I didn't pause. November 2019, retaliation firing disguised as performance review. February 2020, environmental violation covered up with backdated maintenance logs. April 2020, pension fund reallocation that violated fiduciary duty. May 2020, supplier kickback scheme involving Thane's department. That's when I saw it. Thane's hand had stopped moving toward his water glass. His eyes locked on the document in front of Malcolm Reeves. "Wait." Thane's voice cracked. That's not your signature." I met his gaze. "It is. On 17 separate documents authorizing contract modifications that violated our ethics policy. Harlan needed someone in planning to sign off on the paperwork. You were convenient." The color drained from Thane's face. "I didn't know what I was signing. He said they were routine procurement authorizations." I know." My voice softened for just a moment. "You were the scapegoat he was building. If anyone investigated, all the signatures would lead to your desk while he stayed clean." Thane turned to look at Harlan with something beyond betrayal in his eyes. I continued through the evidence. 90 minutes of documentation. 47 separate violations spanning 5 years. Every board member took notes. Darcy Hollins filled 16 pages. Malcolm Reeves asked for copies of everything. Sterling Holbrook sat perfectly still, watching Harlan decompose in real time. By the time I reached the final binder, Harlan had aged a decade. Based on the evidence presented, I said formally, "I am exercising my authority as majority shareholder to terminate Harlan Prescott's employment for cause effective immediately. No severance. No benefits continuation. Security will escort you from the building within the hour." Harlan's hands shook. "You self-righteous son of a bitch. You think you can just—" "I already have." I stood. "Sterling will handle the legal paperwork. The board will vote on interim leadership at our next meeting. This session is—" Wait." Thane's voice cut through the room. He was staring at Harlan with an expression I'd never seen before. "Why me? Why did you make me sign those documents? Why did you—" His voice broke. "Why have you always looked at me like you couldn't decide whether to help me or destroy me?" The boardroom went silent. I reached into my jacket pocket. My fingers closed around the envelope Sterling had given me 5 years ago. The envelope I'd carried every day since waiting for the right moment. The moment when the truth would hurt the most. "Because," I said quietly, "he's your father." I placed the DNA results on the table in front of Thane. "Your mother never told anyone. Not Grady, not the company, not you. But I found out 5 years ago. Had the DNA tested quietly and never told a soul." I looked at Harlan. "He's known for 32 years that he had a son. He watched you grow up. Watched me raise you. Watched Grady run this company until he died. And he never said a word, because acknowledging you would have complicated his perfect executive image." Thane picked up the envelope with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the results. 99.97% probability of paternity. He looked up at Harlan, then at me, then back at the DNA results. "Get out," Thane whispered, still staring at the paper. "Both of you, everyone, get out." The board members gathered their materials in silence. Sterling touched my shoulder once as he passed the only acknowledgement that 15 years of planning had just reached its conclusion. I walked toward the door. Behind me, I heard Thane's voice, raw and broken. "Did you ever plan to tell me?" Harlan said nothing. I closed the boardroom door on the sound of Thane Caldwell's entire identity collapsing into genetic fact. 3 days passed before Thane told me what happened at Harlan's door. And by then, I already knew what rejection looked like. He didn't call, didn't text. The boardroom door closed behind him, and he disappeared into whatever space a man needs when his entire identity gets rewritten in 99.97% certainty. I didn't follow him. Some lessons a son has to learn alone, even when every instinct says to chase him down and explain that DNA doesn't change 32 years of kitchen table conversations and late-night homework help and teaching someone how to drive stick shift in an empty parking lot. I knew where he'd gone, though. Knew it the way you know weather's coming when your joints start aching. He went to find his biological father. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped Thane with fractions at age 7, where I later helped him prepare for his engineering exams, and waited. Made coffee I didn't drink. Watched the clock mark hours in that particular silence that fills a house when someone you raised is out learning hard truths you can't protect them from anymore. By the time Thane told me the details, I'd already lived through them in my head a dozen different ways. But the reality was somehow worse and simpler than any version I'd imagined. Harlan's house sat in one of those upscale neighborhoods where the lawns look painted and the mailboxes cost more than my first car. Thane told me he drove there straight from the boardroom, still wearing his suit, still holding the DNA envelope like it might explain something if he stared at it long enough. Thane told me Harlan answered the door holding a different kind of paper, a grand jury subpoena from Wade Garrison. Not arrested yet, but legally cornered. The FBI moves slower than boardroom terminations, but they move. Thane said he stood there for maybe 10 seconds before he could make his mouth work. "Did you know?" Thane asked. "All those years, did you know I was yours?" Harlan looked at him the way you look at a stranger asking directions to somewhere you've never heard of. Tired. Cold. Already gone, even though he was still standing in his own doorway. "I have no son." 4 words. Then the door closed. Thane said he stood on that porch for 2 minutes after. He told me later he kept thinking Harlan would open the door again, that there'd be some explanation or qualifier or human moment that would make those 4 words mean something different. But the door stayed closed, and the explanation never came. And Thane finally understood what 32 years of my patience had felt like watching Harlan choose himself over everyone else every single time. How do you tell your son that biological fathers can reject, but chosen fathers never stop choosing? You don't tell him. You wait for him to figure it out himself, and you leave your porch light on so he knows where home is when he's ready to come back. He showed up at my door that evening. Didn't knock, just stood there until I opened it. His tie was loose and his eyes were red, and he looked about 16 years old. I made coffee. Real coffee this time, not the stuff I'd been brewing and abandoning all afternoon. We sat at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for 20 minutes. I let the silence stretch. Some conversations need that kind of space. Finally, you knew he'd reject me. I knew you needed to see it yourself, I said. Thane's hands wrapped around his coffee mug. I kept thinking maybe there was a reason. Maybe he was protecting me from something. Or maybe... His voice cracked. Maybe I wasn't worth claiming. That's not on you. That's on him. I'm sorry for... Don't. I met his eyes. We rebuild from here. He nodded, drank his coffee, stayed until almost midnight, not talking much, just existing in the same room, like we were relearning how to be around each other after everything had detonated and settled. When he finally left, he paused at the door. Thanks for leaving the light on. I didn't ask how he knew I'd left it on. Some things you just know. Sterling called a week later with the legal update I'd been expecting. I was in my workshop, couldn't quite bring myself to give up the space, even though I technically owned the entire company now. Old habits. Judge granted a temporary restraining order on your shares, Sterling said. Lorraine's attorney moved fast, claimed risk of asset transfer. It'll hold until the motion to dismiss hearing in 3 weeks. Expected that? Yeah, here's the part you didn't expect. Her attorney withdrew this morning. I set down the wrench I'd been holding. Why? See, Harlan was funding it, paying her legal fees through a shell account we just traced. When his assets froze pending the FBI investigation, her lawyer lost his retainer. Lorraine's standing in the courthouse hallway right now trying to find someone who'll take her case pro bono. Winning doesn't erase the people caught in the blast radius, so she's alone now. The lawsuit's dead weight, Sterling said. She'll either drop it or lose in 6 months. Either way, your control is secure. We'll have final judgment by early 2025 at the latest. He walked me through next steps. Depositions, motions, the standard legal machinery that grinds slow but thorough. I listened, made appropriate responses, let him lay out the roadmap to complete victory. Then I asked the question Sterling wasn't expecting. Will she be okay, Lorraine? The pause on the other end of the line lasted 3 seconds, long enough for Sterling to recalibrate whatever he thought he knew about me. She'll manage, he said carefully. Harlan left her an apartment before his assets froze. She's not destitute. All right, keep me updated. I hung up and stared at my phone for a long moment. 40 years of maintenance work had taught me something boardrooms never could: how to win without losing the part of yourself that remembers what losing feels like. The workshop smelled like machine oil and metal shavings. I picked up my wrench and went back to work. The first thing I did with absolute power wasn't revenge. It was 14 sets of safety gear wrapped in plastic. They arrived the following week, stacked in the workshop storeroom, where I'd spent 43 years requesting equipment that never came. Bright orange protective gear, still sealed, smelling like new rubber, and kept promises. I didn't announce it. Didn't send a company-wide email or call a press conference. Just placed the order Tuesday morning, approved the expense myself, and let the delivery truck show up Friday afternoon. Clifford Whitfield found them first. 62 years old, senior workshop supervisor, the kind of man who'd worked beside me long enough to know which promises mattered. He sent me a photo from his phone, 14 sets of gear lined up like soldiers ready for duty with a single text, "Finally." I was standing at the fourth floor window when the message came through. Executive office. Chairman's view. Glass separating me from the workshop floor I could see spread out below like a map of my entire adult life. 43 years I worked that floor. First decision as chairman took me 6 seconds. Buy the gear. Harlan refused. I looked down through the window. Clifford glanced up from the floor at the same moment. Two men who'd worked side by side for decades, now separated by glass and titles. No words, just nods. The kind of acknowledgement that doesn't need explanation. His second text came through 30 seconds later. Forrest got his check. He wept. I placed the phone on the chairman's desk, still didn't feel like mine, and stared at those words. Forrest Redmond. Spine that would never fully heal. Settlement large enough to cover medical bills and then some. Justice delivered in dollar amounts because you can't give a man his mobility back, but you can acknowledge that losing it wasn't his fault. The mahogany desk reflected the office lights. Leather chair that cost more than my first car. View of the entire plant stretching toward the Ohio horizon. I owned 51% of this company. Fired the CEO. Delivered safety gear and justice and every promise I'd made in 15 years of documented violations. So why did this chair still feel like someone else's? I walked to the window again. Pressed my palm against the glass. Down below, machinery hummed the same rhythm it had hummed for 4 decades. Metal on metal. The sound of work that breaks your body slowly, the kind of breaking nobody notices until fingers go missing, or backs give out, or lungs start filling with things they shouldn't. The glass between executive floor and workshop wasn't just windows, it was the distance success creates from who you were. I spent the rest of October in that office signing papers and attending meetings and learning how to be the thing I'd never planned to become. Chairman, owner. The man whose signature authorized budgets instead of requisition forms. Every night I went home to the same house, sat in the same chair, drank coffee at the same kitchen table, where I once helped Thane with fractions and later taught him persistence. November opened with legal depositions and board restructuring and closed with the annual shareholder meeting that made everything official. Lorraine's lawsuit died quietly in a courthouse filing that Sterling handled without ceremony. Harlan's grand jury indictment came through the third-week fraud obstruction, 6 charges that would keep him occupied for the next 2 years at minimum. I didn't celebrate any of it, just marked time passing and wondered when winning would start feeling different from waiting. December came in cold. Real Ohio winter, the kind that turns breath to mist and makes old injuries ache. I was sitting on my front porch the night Thane called, same wooden chair I'd occupied through 40 years of night shifts, same view of the street, where nothing much ever happened. My phone rang at 7:30. His name on the screen. 2 months of careful distance since the DNA revelation, and Harlan's door closing in his face. I answered. Yeah, I'm sorry. No preamble, no explanation. Just the words themselves, raw and unscripted. I know what I said. Silence on the other end. Not the angry silence from before the searching kind. The sound of someone trying to figure out what comes after apology when you've spent 32 years taking everything for granted. And I don't, Thane's voice caught. I don't know how to... You don't have to know everything right now, I said gently. You just have to show up and figure it out one day at a time. Another pause. My breath misted in the porch light. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and went quiet. Are you doing okay? I asked. The question hung between us. Same words Thane had asked me back in July, standing in that loading dock doorway with contempt barely hidden behind false concern. Now the question came from my mouth to his, and the contempt was gone, replaced by something that felt like actual caring. Thane's breath shook. Not yet. I know, I said again. You spend 5 years planning revenge, then realize what you actually wanted was your son to call and say, "I'm sorry," without knowing why. "I'll call you next week," Thane said. Maybe we could, I don't know. "Coffee? I'll be here." He hung up. I set the phone on the porch railing and watched my breath mist in the December cold. 5 years of meticulous planning, every step calculated, every document prepared, every move designed to bring me to exactly this moment total control of Vanguard Steel. Harlan removed Thane, reconciling justice delivered to workers who'd waited decades for someone to care. I had everything I'd fought for, and for the first time since Sterling handed me that envelope in March 2019, I had absolutely no plan for tomorrow. No next phase, no calculated move, no strategy waiting in the wings. Just December air and an empty evening and a son who might show up for coffee next week. The strange part, the part that surprised me more than anything in 5 years of surprises, was that I was okay with that. I sat on my porch watching breath mist in the light, and I let the future stay uncertain. The difference between seizing power and being elected to it is 2 months and a room full of shareholders who finally know your name. November brought the annual shareholder meeting, the formal kind, with procedural votes and printed agendas, and 200 seats arranged in rows that actually got filled. Different from September's emergency session, where I'd walked into that boardroom as an intruder with a briefcase full of evidence. This time I walked through the auditorium doors as the man whose name appeared on the ballot. Sterling stood at the podium handling procedural announcements, with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Proxy votes tallied. Quorum confirmed. Motions presented in language that turned human decisions into parliamentary syntax. The motion to elect Vernon Caldwell as chairman of the board. Sterling said, his voice carrying across the auditorium without effort. All in favor. Hands rose, not scattered, unanimous. A sea of approval from people who 2 months ago didn't know I existed. Sterling's eyes found mine from across the room. The slightest nod. The motion passes unanimously. Mr. Caldwell, the floor is yours. I walked to the podium. 200 faces turned toward me. Shareholders in suits. New management team Sterling had helped assemble. Workers from the floor scattered throughout, some I recognized, some I didn't. And there, front row center in a wheelchair that hadn't been there 2 months ago, Forrest Redmond. 61 years old. Spine that would never fully heal, legs that worked only part of the time. Invited as honored guest because some things matter more than parliamentary procedure. I had notes. Didn't need them. Spent 43 years learning this speech on a factory floor that taught lessons no business school could replicate. Effective immediately. I said, Vanguard Steel will implement 3 core changes. First, 12% minimum wage increase for all floor workers, retroactive to October 1st. Second, mandatory quarterly third-party safety audits conducted by independent inspectors with full access and reporting authority. Third, establishment of a workplace injury protection fund. Initial allocation $2 million to provide immediate financial assistance to any worker injured on our property, regardless of fault determination or workers' compensation status. I didn't mention Harlan. Didn't mention Thane. Didn't explain that I'd spent 15 years documenting violations, or 5 years planning revenge, or 2 months learning to sit in a chair that still felt borrowed. Just read the changes like a maintenance report. Because that's what they were fixing, what was broken. My eyes found Forrest's when I mentioned the injury fund. Didn't point. Didn't call his name. Just held his gaze for 2 seconds while the auditorium absorbed the $2 million number. Forrest nodded once. Small movement. The kind of acknowledgement that doesn't need amplification. I nodded back. The workers who clapped when I fixed their machines finally saw me fix the system that broke them. The rest of the speech took 6 minutes. Safety protocols. equipment upgrade timelines, third-party oversight mechanisms. Everything I'd wanted to implement for 43 years delivered in bullet points that turned decades of frustration into actionable policy. When I finished, the auditorium went quiet. Not the stunned silence from September's boardroom, the procedural kind. Meeting silence. The sound of people processing information and checking watches and mentally composing questions about margin impact. No applause, wasn't that kind of speech. Didn't need to be. I stepped down from the podium. Sterling moved to the microphone to handle Q&A about financial projections and competitive positioning, the questions shareholders actually cared about. I stood to the side and listened to them discuss worker protections like line items on a budget report. 12% increase, what's the projected margin impact? Third-party audits, frequency of reporting. Injury fund is $2 million the cap or annual allocation. They saw numbers. I saw Ray Mercer's widow finally getting the pension she'd been denied. Saw Dorothy Kimball's daughter not having to choose between childcare and overtime. Saw safety rails that would actually stay installed. You'd think becoming chairman would feel like victory. But standing at that podium felt like finally having the right wrench for a job I'd been doing wrong for 40 years. Sterling fielded questions for another 20 minutes. When the meeting finally concluded, shareholders filed out in clusters, still discussing financials. The workers left slower, some stopping to shake my hand. Short exchanges. Thank you. About time. Appreciate it. I stood near the windows overlooking the factory floor. Same windows I'd spent 2 months staring through from the executive office above, watching the work I used to do continue without me. Clifford Whitfield found me there. 62 years old, hands scarred from the same machinery that had marked mine, eyes that had seen 40 years of promises broken and equipment deferred and safety measures ignored. He extended his hand. I shook it. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Not loud enough for anyone else to hear. Just two men who'd worked side by side long enough to skip the pleasantries. About what? It's now 15 years. He didn't need to elaborate. 15 years of knowing I owned the company while Harlan ran it into the ground. 15 years of documenting violations I couldn't stop. 15 years of watching good people get hurt while I played the long game. I looked down through the auditorium windows at the plant floor below. Metal presses and cutting stations and the workshop where I'd spent 4 decades learning what mattered. Same floor, same machinery, different understanding. 1, 2, D2, I said, because those 15 years are the reason I know what I'm doing today. Every humiliation taught me what powerlessness felt like. Every ignored safety complaint showed me what indifference cost. Every 68-hour week reminded me that the people operating machinery weren't line items, they were human beings whose bodies broke when you treated steel as more valuable than the hands that shaped it. The maintenance worker didn't just become chairman. He became the only chairman who actually understood what the workers needed because he'd been one of them long enough to earn the knowledge. Clifford studied my face for a long moment, then nodded. Good answer. He walked away. Sterling approached with final paperwork. Official documentation of my election, signatures required legal formalities that turned shareholder approval into binding authority. I signed where he indicated. Returned to watching the factory floor through glass that separated me from the work I used to know. The meeting was over. The transformation was official. Now came the part I hadn't planned, figuring out what comes next. My son arrived for his first shift in the same orange coveralls I wore for 43 years, earning the same minimum wage I started at in 1981. 5:45 in the morning. December, cold, turning breath to fog under the pale yellow shop lights that marked Vanguard's employee parking lot. I stood at the fourth-floor window, watching Thane's sedan pull into a space I'd occupied 1,000 times far end, near the fence where executives never parked, because it was too far from the door. He stepped out. Orange coveralls still stiff with newness fabric that hadn't learned the shape of a body yet. Lunchbox in one hand, metal not plastic, the kind that said someone cared about doing this right. He stood there for maybe 10 seconds, staring at the bay entrance like it was a door he couldn't decide whether to open or run from. He didn't have to do this. The DOJ had cleared Thane of criminal liability. He'd signed documents without understanding their purpose, and the evidence showed Harlan had deliberately kept him uninformed. 300 hours on the floor was Thane's own idea, a civil repayment he proposed himself. His choice to accept it. His choice to start today. I watched him walk toward the entrance. Same path I'd walked in February 1981 when Grady Whitmore hired a 19-year-old kid who needed work more than he needed explanations about what the work would cost. Clifford Whitfield stood at the bay entrance, waiting. 62-years-old hands that had taught mine how to hold a wrench properly back, that had bent over the same machines for 4 decades. He saw Thane approaching and nodded once. "Time to start," Clifford said. Not loud, not mocking. Just the simple statement of a man who'd greeted 1,000 first shifts and knew exactly what they required. Thane's voice came quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Where do I tantu? Machine B7. Follow me." They disappeared through the bay doors. I turned from the window and walked to my desk. Chairman's desk. Still didn't feel entirely mine, but I'd stopped fighting the feeling. Some things you grow into slowly. I opened a new notebook. Fresh pages. Blank. Different from the 7 notebooks filled over 15 years. Those were evidence logs, countdown markers, strategy documents. This notebook had no plan. No evidence, no countdown, just blank pages waiting. I started writing. Same format as 43 years of maintenance logs, date, time, temperature conditions. Then paused. Wrote, Day 1 of Year 2. Year 1 was the boardroom. Year 2 was the floor. I picked up the pen again and wrote the thing I'd never said out loud in 43 years. I didn't do it because it was worth it. I did it because it was the only way I knew how to love people who wouldn't let me love them the easy way. Lorraine, who left because I worked too much and listened too little. Thane, who inherited his mother's resentment and his biological father's coldness, and somehow still became the son I chose to raise when Grady died. Workers like Forrest, who lost the use of his legs, and Ray, who lost his life, and Dorothy, who lost decades waiting for someone to care. 68 hours a week wasn't work ethic. It was the vocabulary I had for love when words kept failing and presence was the only language left. I closed the notebook. Looked down at Thane struggling with Machine B7, learning what his hands could do when his assumptions stopped getting in the way. The hard way was the only way that could have worked. I drank my coffee. Watched my son learn, the workshop floor hummed below, and for the first time in 5 years I wasn't counting down to anything, just watching time build something instead of tearing something down. That felt like enough. And to you listening to my story, remember this: patience isn't weakness, and silence isn't surrender. Looking back on 15 years of waiting, I don't regret the strategy, but I do regret the distance. I thought documenting violations was enough. What I should have done was reach my son before the boardroom became our only meeting place. Don't make my mistake. If someone you love is slipping away, speak up before you need evidence to prove you were right. Here's what I learned. Family justice isn't about winning, it's about teaching. I could have destroyed Harlan overnight with that 51%. But real change happens when people choose to walk a different path. That's why watching Thane arrive at 5:45 in coveralls meant more than any boardroom victory. I believe God put me through those long weeks not to break me, but to show me what real work looks like showing up for people who don't know they need you yet. If you've ever felt invisible in your family, or if you're living your own dad's revenge stories where patience is your weapon, drop a comment. Tell me, would you have waited 15 years or confronted them sooner? If this resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that family justice requires the long game. Subscribe to Wise Revenge for more stories. Thank you for staying until the very end. Like all Dad's revenge stories here, this contains fictionalized elements to protect privacy and highlight lessons. What matters is the message. Sometimes love looks like hard work, and sometimes revenge looks like forgiveness.